All right, Matti, how nice to see you finally, by the way. And I'm so sorry that we cannot meet face to face in Krakow. However, however, I really do hope that we will meet, maybe in the end of the year, maybe next year. Anyway, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm sorry to be speaking to you long distance and not
Uh,
not in person, but these are strange times we're living in, and at least technology allows us to speak in some form.
okay, so let me explain you uh, some difficulties because honestly speaking, we should speak about this amazing dreamy book, Spices of No Country. However, before we approach the main theme, I want to ask you some questions to build just some kind of a background because one of the things which concerns me very much, very deeply, is that if few people in Poland, if read it, so it's only a few people. Unfortunately, your books, which is absolutely shame, are still not translated to Polish. So beside of, but if you allows me to go to the one of the publishing house, and I'm serious right now, so I'll be more than happy to ask them or to contact them with your agent because this is one of the really most important book, not only about the history, but through the history about the contemporary reality of Israel. Anyway, so Mati, I'm sitting in Krakow, and you're sitting in Jerusalem, and I'm sitting in Krakow in Poland, and I think myself that even I'm not Jewish, which means that I'm very Jewish, I'm inherited of all this Ashkenazic tradition. And it such easily comes to my mind names like, of course, Theodor Herz, by the way, he's over here. And David Ben Gurion, which is David Green, who was born in Poland, Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, who was born close to Poland, and of course, Yohanan Bader, Achacharam, Zev Zabotinsky, Menachem Begin, Leon Pinsker, Yitzhak Shamir, Shimon Peres, etc., etc., etc. So I was overwhelmed when on 1992 I made my first trip abroad. I was sure that I'm going to the Ashkenazi, so-called white country. And honestly speaking, when I met the people in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, my people, I just was more than sure that Israel is created by the Ashkenazi people who came from the Eastern Europe. So what happened? I think that it's still Ashkenazi country.
I mean, it's true that our kind of pantheon remains very Polish, as you pointed out. And when we think about the founding fathers of Israel, we think about people like David Grün from Plonsk and who became David Ben Gurion, and that's still very much the story of Israel as outsiders think of it, and to some extent as Israelis think of it too. We
Oh,
tell the
you said
story
outsiders, right?
outsiders and to some extent Israelis too. When we think about the official story of Israel, we tell it, Theodor Herzl in Vienna, pogroms in Eastern Europe, socialism, the kibbutz idea, the Holocaust, and the founding of the state. And that's still the way we tell the story of the country. But if you look at the society of the country, the real place as it exists, if I go out right now into the street in Jerusalem and I talk to people about where they're from, you'll find something interesting, which is that half of the Jews in Israel don't come from Europe. Half of the Jewish population of Israel actually has roots in the Islamic world. And that remains a marginal element in the story of Israel as it's officially told, but a very important piece, maybe the most important piece of Israeli society. You can't understand this country at all through the lens of Europe. It's possible that you can understand the founding of the state through the lens of Europe, but not Israel in 2020. The country
Ah,
really only makes sense it's understood as a kind of Middle Eastern or Mediterranean Jewish society in which the Eastern European element, which used to be dominant, is fading increasingly into irrelevance.
Well, you know, it's a little bit provocative from my side, but let me continue there because I remember, you know, the day after I landed in Tel Aviv, I found myself in a bus. It was 1992, of course, many, many, many years ago, almost 30 years ago. So I found myself in the bus, and suddenly I noticed that I'm lost, completely lost. I don't know where I'm going. I just lost direction. And what I did, I loudly asked the people who sat in the bus, is anyone here who speaks Polish? And believe me, like 7, maybe 10 people raised their hands and said, me. And one of the guys said, just remember, if you're in Israel, you always find someone who speaks Polish. But of course, it was in 1992. The second part of my journey to Israel was that I was looking for the one man whom I wanted to invite to Krakow, and he wasn't Ashkenazi. I was so impressed of his music on 1992, and I found this guy, and I invited him to Krakow. He was, and he still is, Shlomo Bar and Habrera Hativi, this Moroccan, Persian, Iraqi, Indian, you know, Jewish band. So when it happened, when this perspective of so-called Ashkenazi Israel has been changed during these almost 30 years, that now, and I agree absolutely with you, we can speak about the Middle East, Israel, not necessarily Ashkenazic or Western European.
Right. That's a great story about the bus, because I think that if you tried it today, you would find no one who spoke Polish. You still might find a lot of Russian speakers, of course, because of the immigration from the Soviet Union in the 90s. But an Israeli bus doesn't look like Poland, and it doesn't really look like Europe at all. And I grew up in Canada. It certainly doesn't look like Canada. If you come to Israel expecting to find Europe, you're going to be very confused. But if you come to Israel from a place like Beirut or Alexandria, the kind of great cosmopolitan Mediterranean cities of the Islamic world, it makes a lot of sense. For example, if you turn on an Israeli pop music station, what you're going to hear is a kind of Middle Eastern pop music, which we call Mizrahi. That means Eastern. That's the dominant form of pop music. In Israel, it's very strange to Western ears. It doesn't really sound like Western pop music. It's in Hebrew. It's a native form of music, but it's Middle Eastern. So the old days of Israeli music, which was heavy on Russian folk songs or Russian folk tunes with Hebrew words, those days are gone. Popular culture here is very Middle Eastern. The way Judaism is practiced here is very Middle Eastern. For a North American Jew coming to Israel, it's often very confusing. Where is conservative Judaism? Where is Reform Judaism? Well, it doesn't really exist here to any significant extent. But if you understand what Middle Eastern religion looks like, even if it's Middle Eastern Islam or Middle Eastern Christianity, Israel will make sense to you. Or food. North American Jews, which is, of course, the big Jewish community outside Israel, that they come to Israel and look for bagels, because it's a Jewish state. So where are the bagels? Right, that's the ultimate Jewish food. And if you're looking for bagels in Israel, you won't find them. Or you can find them these days, but it's new. And Israelis think that it's American food, not Jewish food. But if you go to the supermarket, what you're going to find is hummus and couscous and the food of the Levant, because that's what Jews in Israel think is Jewish food. It's the Jewish food of their own families, which came from places like Morocco and Syria, and didn't come from Krakow and didn't come from Toronto, which is where I'm from. So it's often a challenge for Jewish people coming to this country from North America. It's a challenge to understand what it means that this is a Jewish country, because it doesn't resemble any kind of Western Judaism that people are familiar with, and it doesn't really resemble Europe at all. In fact, there was a pop hit a few years ago in the Mizrahi genre, which was called "This Isn't Europe," and it was a joke about Jews or Israelis of European descent kind of longing for Europe and going to places like Amsterdam and moving to Berlin, which many Israeli hipsters do. And the song was making fun of them. It was saying, this isn't Europe. this is the Middle East. Get used to it. It's a great song. I highly recommend it.
I absolutely agree with you. And I tell you, I was so upset like 1 year ago, suddenly in one of my favorite places in Yerushalayim, Machne Yehuda, I discovered the place, the booth with a German sausage. Do you know where is it? On the corner of one of the streets. Mazim Makara, I asked myself, I'm in the Middle East. I don't want to taste the German sausage, which I have easily flew abroad, of course. So, absolutely. However, when you will go to be a Jewish quarter in Yerushalayim, so we can easily get the burger, schmurger, whatever it is. It is, of course, the American Jewish people came to Israel and they wanted to feel like home. But this is not a place, they implanted it. But this is not a place where this kind of food, this kind of a culture arises from the many, many, many centuries. Once again, coming back to the beginning, I remember, one of the famous Jewish musicians, the violin player and composer also, but basically violin player, was Bronisław Huberman. And Bronisław Huberman was the founder of the National Philharmonic Orchestra in Tel Aviv. Moreover, he invited, I remember 1936, December 26, Arturo Toscani, who conducted first. So I'm coming back to the roots because and I'm sure that yes, if the Ashkenazic people from Eastern Europe had, and maybe still have, the influence of the so-called cultural and political and economical landscape of Israel, so what it was, what it is, what left from this beginning up to today.
I mean, I think that you'll find here what is basically a hybrid culture. So you still have a lot of and of course you have classical music and you have a European form of government, right? A parliamentary democracy. That's an import from Europe. No other country in the Middle East has one that functions. So it's not, it's going too far to say this is the Middle East and that's it. Of course, it's a hybrid society that's formed by, many different pieces. But if you look at Israeli society kind of in very general terms, you have 1/5 of our citizens who are Arab Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
You have an 80% Jewish majority that's split into half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi. Again, that's very generalized. Half of European descent, half of descent from the Islamic world. And the culture is a mix of it. So the food is a mix of it. And often, you'll have, if you go to the shuk in Machane Yehuda, you'll find German sausage and you'll find a hamburger. And you'll find mostly Middle Eastern food. Sometimes in the same restaurant, you'll find different cultural influences. And that's one of the things that makes the country so interesting and dynamic is that blend. It's got a whole bunch of different things going on. Sometimes things really clash with each other. Ideas of religious freedom, ideas of gender equality. There are even fights here about music, about what Israeli music is. So it's not all love and brotherhood, you know what I mean? But the meeting of the cultures creates an electricity that really makes this a very special and very dynamic place.
We'll jump later to the Jews in the Islamic world because this is almost completely unknown in Poland. We still have to have in the back of our head that we are talking, and most of the people who will watch us are from Poland, so they basically know nothing. But let me tell you something. I was, and I'm still very sensitive in terms of the, this diversified Jewish world, which I found in 1992 in Israel. So the festival we have been organizing right now 32 years. It's unbelievable. We hosted a lot of phenomenal people from we started with Chabra Khativi, it was Moroccan musicians, Yemenite, Persian, Iraqi, Ethiopian, from Maghreb, from Turkey. I remember, and this is something which probably I've never told you about it. I remember when I invited the very famous rabbi and paitan, David Menachem, and he came together with the Diwan Sas and Muezzin. And instead of telling people don't be anti-Semites, don't be anti-Israeli, love each other, like Rabbi Hillel used to say 2,000 years ago. I put them on the stage in a synagogue. They gave amazing concert just 1 hour before the Shabbat. They sang together, and day after Shabbat on Shiroka Street, they sang to the in front of the, like 18,000 people, and it was just right after Havdalah, and these two guys, Ara Muezzin and the Sephardic Mizrahi rabbis sang together, hang each other, Hey Eliyahu. And this is the way how we show people that the world is totally, totally different, diversified. And the only thing we should do is to respect it and respect each other.
I think that there was always a misunderstanding in the West about how the connection between Israelis and Arabs was going to happen. And I was party to that misconception, I think, as someone who came from the West. We thought that the left would be the connection. So the political left in Israel would open doors to the Palestinians and to the Arab world. And in the 1990s, which is when I moved to Israel, there were all kinds of peace initiatives to bring people together. And it was very much happening on the secular left. And it didn't work. And it turns out that the real connection point is the Middle Easternness of Israel, which ironically tends to lean to the political right. So the political left in Israel is largely Ashkenazi. And often it's people who actually seek peace with the Arab world, but don't necessarily have a high opinion of Arab culture or of the Jews who came from that culture. And that's one of the kind of ironies that you learn as you live in Israel. It takes a while to figure out that the people who are closest to the Arab world in culture and in society and in music are not the nice Ashkenazim of the left. Actually, it's people who came from places like Morocco and Syria and Iraq, and who tend to lean to the political right, tend to vote for the Likud. So they have right-wing politics, but actually an affinity for the culture of this part of the world. And that would explain an amazing person like David Menachem, who's an Orthodox rabbi, a traditional guy who loves Arabic music. It's the music of his family. And the connection between him and a muezzin is very natural. It wouldn't be natural to have a left-wing political activist in that muezzin. They wouldn't understand what the other is talking about on either side. Exactly. But the Muslim understands David Menachem, and David Menachem understands the Muslim cleric because they speak a similar language, and sometimes that brings them into conflict, and in other ways it opens up many avenues for communication. And I think that's increasingly clear.
Look, I remember like 2 years ago, even 1 year ago, we loved very much Netta El-Kayam. And Netta El-Kayam performed in Krakow 4 times. One of her concerts was dedicated to the Arabic singing, speaking Jewish diva. And I'm so sorry, I'm getting older, I've forgotten her name, it's my shame. But I remember many people, basically from American Jewish people were shocked. But during the Jewish Country Festival, the Israeli girl sings in Arabic inside of a synagogue. But this is the way how we, as the organizers, want to break the stereotypes, caricatures, and all these kind of things which makes us so far each other. Matti, by the way, I knew nothing about you till the moment when I read about you in one of the portals leading by the Polish couple. They translated a few articles he wrote, and they wrote, of course, about your book. This is via Andrzej and Małgorzata Koraszewski, and they are the great people. I want to thank them very much, because thanks for them, I met you. But you made Aliyah when you were 17 years old. You're a kid. So he came to Israel, a young Ashkenazi man, who probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but expected to find himself in the society of people similar to him. And what happened? You were sent immediately to the war. And one of your books, The Tapkin Flowers, is about it. So this is what probably changed completely your perspective on the Israel. So what happened to you when you discovered that there is at least at least two dimension of Israel? The first, let's say this, fiction like a postcard Israel, touristic place, full, and the most important, which changed our life all the time, documentary, multiply of countless layers of reality, and you face the one of the most danger reality of Israel, which is a daily reality, by the way, and people don't understand it, especially from there. You were 18 years old guy. What happened that time?
I came to Israel with very simple stories about Israel as we were discussing, and mainly what I knew about Israel was the kibbutz. And I'd read a lot about the kibbutz, and when I came to Israel, I went to a kibbutz, and then within a very short period of time after I decided to stay permanently.
Where was this kibbutz?
This was a very small religious kibbutz called Ma'ale Gilboa, which is like a 2-hour...
Excuse me to interrupt you, Matti. Religious, you said religious. You come from a religious family?
I come from a religious family, and there's a very small part of the kibbutz movement that is, I would say, moderately religious. Most of the kibbutz movement, of course, is militantly secular, but there's a small group of kibbutzim that were always trying to kind of align orthodoxy and socialism. It's an interesting sub story, but I ended up on a kibbutz like that, Ma'ale Gilboa, and then within a very short period of time, I found myself in the army in South Lebanon, where Israel controlled a buffer zone that we called the security zone. This was the late 1990s during a kind of small guerrilla war with Hezbollah. I found myself, I was 19, I was on this hilltop inside Lebanon. We had allies who were Arabic-speaking Christians. We had enemies who were Lebanese Shia. I was with Israeli soldiers, many of whom were Iraqis and Persians and Moroccans. And I realized I had no idea where I was. The country that I thought I was coming to was not the country.
So you even had no time to just root it in Israel in the normal way.
I barely had a handle on the thing at all. And suddenly I was in this extremely confusing situation that really forced me to realize and to admit that I didn't know where I was. And I think that since then I've been trying to answer that question. I think really it was the experience of being in Lebanon, very confused in this very dangerous country, but also a fascinating and beautiful country. It was a very compelling place. And I wanted to understand it. I didn't understand it. And since then I've been trying to understand it. And I think that if you want to kind of look at what connects all of my writing, it's that. It's me trying to understand this place where I've found myself and where I've made my home, having admitted to myself that the simple kind of fantasy land that I imagined when I came doesn't exist, and that I'm actually in a completely different place.
It reminds me something, because when you're writing in your book about this it's unbelievable. It's like a Conan Doyle. It's like I don't know, Stephen King. It's just amazing book. And you're writing about 4 of them, and suddenly they found themselves in a place where they dream about in Israel, and were immediately sent back. They grew up in the homeland called, I don't know, Syria or Lebanon or whatever, and they came to Israel because they were Zionists, and because they were also the Islamic Jews, so they were sent back. So, but when they where they found themselves once again in the homeland, it wasn't the homeland anymore. It was a very dangerous place for them. But it's exactly like you, more or less, because you came to Israel full of hopeness and expectation, and suddenly someone kicked you out from Israel and straight to the Lebanon. And by the way, it wasn't just you didn't serve in the army. It was every day was life or death, and this is something which people cannot understand, not only in Poland but also in states, and exactly states. The West perception, which makes me really crazy. We know a little bit each other, so what is my opinion about it, but this West perception, including Polish, of course, perception on Israel, is totally different from Israeli inner perspective, I think. This is first. And for instance, United Nations or so-called United Nations apply double or even triple standards to Israel, of course, taking a lot of unfair resolutions, but also, and I just got this book, but also is a deep rift between American Jews and Israeli Jews. And this is what bothering me all the time, because even we became the Israeli festival, we have a lot of friends among the American Jewish people who do not understand that what for them is theoretical political issue, for you is the existential issue. So just want to ask you about your opinion about this very, very dramatic rift between American Jewish people and Israel.
I think that rift is very real, and Daniel Gordis wrote about it, and because it's a matter of real concern for those of us who exist on the line between the two communities. There are basically two major Jewish communities today, almost equal in size in Israel and in North America. The Israeli Jewish community is slightly bigger for the first time. The weight is shifting in this direction, but the gap is growing, and it's growing for a few reasons. One, I think, is just almost genetic. In 1948, you'd have two brothers. Two brothers from Krakow. One came to Tel Aviv, and one went to New York. But they were siblings. They would, they were close to each other. And then in the next generation, it's cousins. So you have Israeli cousins. Some are Israelis and some are Americans, but they're cousins. That's still pretty close. At this point in 2020, it's not even cousins. People don't really have cousins in the other community in the same way that they used to. The family trees have grown apart. And that's just natural. That's the way it works. And American Jews, as generations pass, are being formed more and more by America and by what America is. And Jews here in the Middle East are being formed more and more by the Middle East. And those are two very different cultural worlds. So the expectation that communication between these two worlds is going to be easy is no longer realistic. It's not going to be easy. These are completely different places, and they're completely different people. And I think that we have to realize that a lot more effort is going to be necessary to enable us to communicate. And the expectation in the old days that we were all going to say, Golda Meir, oh, Golda Meir, and everyone would know what that was, or the 6-Day War. It's not like that anymore. It's increasingly hard for American Jews to understand Israel. And it goes the other way too. But Israel is a country being formed by forces that American Jews really can't understand because they live in a completely different place and have very often outmoded or simplistic ideas about the challenges that Israel faces or the threats that Israel faces. So I don't think we necessarily do a great job in dealing with all of those threats and challenges, but I think that many of our critics don't even understand what the threats or challenges are. Understanding it requires understanding, first of all, before we understand anything else, Israel is in the Middle East. Look at a map and see where it is. It's not New Jersey, it's not Krakow, it's not Italy.
Exactly.
It's in the Middle East. Our neighbors are, going clockwise, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, with Yemen and the Saudis not too far away, and of course the Palestinians right next door. So this is a very different political and social context, and that needs to be understood first of all before we get into the questions of why Israel does what it does.
Yeah, I noticed that this gap is the deeper and wider, unfortunately. On the other hand, it's a paradox. Now we are facing and I'm just wondering, what do you think about it, especially after what Gamaliel said? What do you think about this deal between the Emirates and Bahrain? And by the way, leading by the Donald Trump, who was, by the way, the only president who did what he said that he will do. On the other hand, he is who he is, of course. I'm not going to go to the political track right now, but that's what we are facing right now. And by the way, you have to know that almost nothing you can find in the Polish newspapers about it, only a few articles. And this is, in my opinion, one of the most historical challenges and historical moment for Israel. On the other hand, I still have in my mind what one of your spies said. And by the way, this is what he said on the 174 or yeah, probably 174 pages of your book that you mentioned about the Oslo, you mentioned about the many agreements, and nothing happened. Do you really believe, Matti? Do you really believe that this peace between the and now we are touching the very, very significant moment between Israel and the Arab world, not Palestinian world, but Arab world, is possible?
I think that I agree that this was a very significant moment, what happened in Washington with Bahrain and the Emirates. And I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the idea that the conflict is primarily Israeli-Palestinian, is a Western fantasy. It's just a way of making something very complicated simple enough for Western audiences to understand. There's when you write a news story, which is what I did for a living for a long time, you don't have room in a story for 6 different actors, 12 different actors. You need 2. So it became Israelis and Palestinians, but the truth is Israel's conflict has never been primarily with the Palestinians. Israel fought a war in 1948 against Egyptians and Jordanians and Iraqis and Lebanese and Syrians. And after that, Iran became the prime enemy. The Palestinian. The conflict is regional. Israel is involved in a regional conflict. And the conflict with Israel is only one of several conflicts going on in the region, most of which have nothing to do with Israel. So to understand it all, you have to zoom out and see the Middle East and understand that the Palestinians and the Israelis are just 2 minor actors in a much bigger picture. And once you understand it like that, then it becomes much easier to understand what just happened in Washington with this agreement. For many of the players in the Middle East, the Palestinians are not the main priority. In fact, they're not in the first 5 or maybe not in the first 10 priorities. They're much more burning priorities for countries in the Middle East, including Israel. The main priority for many of the countries that are in the American alliance system here, the Sunni countries like the Saudis, the countries around the Persian Gulf, the Egyptians and the Jordanians to some extent. The issue is the rise of Iran as a regional power. That's what people are worried about, the expansion of Iranian influence across the region.
Oh, absolutely. I remember like 2 weeks ago was the summit of the Arab League, and they didn't support the Palestinians vote. Exactly. It was so significant.
Right.
Once again, I still know that we are talking Poland, and people know nothing about it. People, when it comes to the discussion about the Israel and Palestinian relations, the Israel is apartheid. They treat the Palestinians like animals, like this. Hey, it's only a slight, very small part of the bigger picture, but no one is writing about it. No one is telling about it. That's why it's such important is also for us, people who are caring about Israel, to read this book, because this is not only a book about the spices. It's not about the 1948, 1947, 1946, whatever. It's about the 2020. Absolutely, it's my opinion, and especially that Arabic propaganda, and Arabic propaganda, and according to the many people, by the way, many nations in Europe, of course, Arabic propaganda says that Israelis are not the native population, of course, and they are foreigners, by force implanted into the Arabic body. They are the so-called post-Holocaust virus, even not the cancer. And this is also the very popular view and point of view in the European media. And you are the man of the media. And you many times said against this kind of the manipulation. So just tell me, please, I know what you are going to say, but tell it openly and loudly. Is it truth that Israel came to being because of the Holocaust?
Just getting back to that great moment a few weeks ago when the Israeli delegation arrives in the Emirates, the first Israeli delegation lands, and it's headed by the head of the National Security Council here, a guy named Ben Shabbat. And Ben Shabbat is this little guy in a suit with a big kippah, and he looks Middle Eastern. And he gets off the plane, and he's standing on the tarmac, in the Emirates, and he opens his mouth and speaks beautiful native Arabic and gives a speech in Arabic. And this is an Israeli. And that never happened in the days of the Oslo peace accords, right? This guy is clearly not from Europe. He's clearly not a Holocaust survivor. He's something else. And the optics of that were so interesting because, of course, Israel's founding has a lot to do with what happens in Europe. And the Zionists who dreamed up Israel were being pushed out of Europe by anti-Semitism and realized, some of them realized what was going to happen in the 1940s and what ultimately happened. But that's only half of Israel's story, and maybe in 2020, not even half. Half of the Jewish population here is ethnically cleansed from the Islamic world. And there are a few reasons why the story of Israel as a colonialist implant really takes off and kind of catches on in the European mind. Part of it, I think, is our fault. Israel always wanted to be European. The Zionist movement always wanted to be European because Jews in Europe had been mocked as, swarthy, dark, Oriental foreigners for many centuries, and they wanted to be European like everyone else. So the propaganda of the Zionist movement in the early days was always a blonde pioneer who was mowing the field during the day and then at night listening to Beethoven in the kibbutz dining hall. That was part of it. So part of the misperception is our own fault. We've always played up our European nature and played down our Middle Eastern nature because no one here wanted to be Middle Eastern, including people who came from the Middle East. We wanted to be something else. Another part of it, of course, is the Arab world. For the Arab world, the fact that half of the Jewish population in Israel has its roots in the Islamic world, mostly in Arab states, it's very problematic. If you live in Cairo, then you know that a big part of downtown Cairo is called the Jewish Quarter, Harat al-Yahud. Tens of thousands of people used to live there. Where did they go? It's still called the Jewish Quarter, but there are no Jews there. So and that's true of almost every major Arab city. There's a Jewish quarter in almost every major Arab city. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, in the 1940s is 1/3 Jewish. Where did all these people go? It's an uncomfortable question for the Arab world. What happened to their property? So it's much easier to portray Israel as a colonialist implant and pretend that everyone's European than to admit what the Arab world did to its native Jewish population. And they've seized on the story of Israel as a colonialist entity, not just to make Europe feel guilty, which is part of the idea, and that's been quite effective, I think. Right. But part of it is to conceal their own guilt in an ethnic cleansing of one of the oldest native communities in the Middle East. Would Israel exist had the Arab world been kind to its Jews? Maybe, maybe not. Israel would have half of its current Jewish population. Would Israel exist in that? Under those circumstances, I'm not sure. The Arab world created Israel, I would say, almost to the same extent that it was created by Europe. And the story is much more complicated than the story about that blonde European who came from somewhere else and imposed himself on the native Muslim population. The question of who is native is much more, I think, murky in Israel's case than people understand.
Oh, absolutely. Being in Yerushalayim, we see a lot of traces of a different kind of cultures, but basically it's an Eastern culture. There's no doubt. And this book, which once again must be read by everyone who is curious about Israel. It's Spices of No Country, but Matti, I'm confused. How can be a spice of a country when you do not have a country? Hey, come on. What does it mean? What does it mean? Technically, literally, I am a spy, and I want to search my country, which, this part of a region I love it because it's totally unpredictable. Who knew that time that Israel will arise?
Right. These guys are kids. Some of them are even street kids, I would say. Some of them are orphans. They end up in Israel before it's Israel, so before there's a state. They have no country. They're just kind of hoping that one day there's going to be a country. And then they're sent back into the Arab world, and they're sent back, which is their native world. That's where they're from, and they're sent back pretending to be Arab refugees from the Jewish state. So these kids are Jewish refugees from Arab countries, pretending to be Arab refugees from a Jewish country. And the layers of displacement and identity confusion in their story are what makes the story so interesting. They don't have a country when they leave. The spies leave in early 1948 before there's a state. They don't know when they leave on their mission if there's going to be anything to come back to. And they leave at a moment where it seems at least possible that the Jews are going to lose the war and that there won't be a state of Israel and that they're just going to be stranded in the Arab world. That's what's interesting about them. I think if you're spying for the CIA, it's scary, I'm sure, but
I know something about it.
You know that there's a place called, Langley, CIA headquarters, and someone has you on a list, and you're serving a country that exists. These guys had nothing. They didn't make salaries. They didn't own a radio at first. They had no way to communicate. They were completely amateur, and the amateur nature of their mission gets a bunch of them killed. That kind of tenuous aspect to their story is what I love about the story, because people know stories, of course, about the Mossad and all these stories about Israeli heroism and intelligence, and this is not that kind of story. This is a story about a few very young people who didn't know what they were doing and had no guarantees that they were going to come back, but they went anyway. And they helped to create a country against very steep odds.
It's amazing. I'm just looking at the pictures. Gamaliel Cohen, born Damascus, Syria, 25 years old. Isaac Shashan, alias Abdul Karim, born Syria, Aleppo, age 23. Habakkuk Cohen, alias Ibrahim, born Yemen, age 20. Yakuba Cohen, we'll come back to the Cohen in a moment, alias Jamil, born in Yerushalayim, age 23. We know about them thanks to you. The whole world, let's say whole world, knows about the Eli Cohen, of course, because Eli Cohen was captured and finally sentenced to death, and the Egyptians, hanged him on the square. So, but who knew till you wrote this book about these Cohens? By the way, you can watch this movie with Sacha Baron, of course, Cohen, in a Netflix, and I saw it. But and more and more people in Poland are interested in this subject. But how many of these young people? What made them to be a spy? I know the answer, but what made these people without land, only with a dream and a love? What made them to be a spy?
There's a few things going on in their story. They understand, they're very young, but I think they understand that there's no future for them in the Arab world. Isaac Shoshan, for example, is one of the spies. He grows up in Aleppo. He's the son of a janitor. He's a barefoot kid from the alleys of the poorest part of Aleppo, and he senses, I think, the hostility to Jews that's growing in the Arab world. The community is ancient in Aleppo. The Jewish community in Aleppo, Syria, is much older than Islam. They've been there forever, but they understand that things are changing. The ground is shaking. So he runs away to join the Zionists and finds it hard to be accepted by them because he looks like the enemy. He speaks Arabic. He seems Arab in his appearance, in his culture, and he can't shed that difference. He can't become like the Sabras, which is what he wants. And then before the War of Independence is about to start, the Jewish military underground understands that these kids who speak Arabic are actually valuable because they can be sent back across the lines to collect intelligence.
Right.
The thing that made them different, the thing that was interfering with their acceptance, becomes their ticket into the Jewish national movement, into the holy of holies of the national movement, which is the Palmach.
I wanted to mention.
Right, so it's their disability, their Arabness, which is a social disability in Israel at the time, that becomes their weapon. That is another thing that makes these guys particularly.
So that's what I want to ask you, Matti, because before I ask you about the spy whom you met, right now he's
96.
Baruch Hashem to 120. So the people in Poland, I don't think that they heard this word. This is very important in terms of Haganah, of Palmach. Mr. Aravim. Please tell us about it. What does it mean, Mr. Aravim? Because this is something unbelievably important.
Right, that's the key word in this book, and it's such an interesting word. It's a Hebrew word, mista'arvim. That's the plural. A singular is mista'arev. And it's a Hebrew word that is untranslatable in English. And all we can do is explain what it means in a kind of long sentence. What it means is one who becomes like an Arab. So there's a verb in Israel that describes the action of becoming like an Arab, which is fascinating and says something interesting about the society. Why is there a word for that? It seems very weird that there would be. When this intelligence operation starts, the one that's in my book, the Arab section, that's what it was called, they didn't like the word spies. They didn't want to call themselves spies because they thought in Arabic, the word spies is dishonorable. In English, to be a spy, it's a bit glamorous. It doesn't have a negative connotation necessarily, but in Arabic, it means traitor. It's not something that you want to be. They didn't want to call themselves spies. They needed a different word. And they find a word by reaching back into the history of the Jews of Arab lands. For example, in Aleppo, Syria, there were always two Jewish communities. One was called Sfaradim, meaning literally Jews who came from Spain. These are Jews who came to the Ottoman Empire after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, Sfaradim. The other community in Aleppo had been there before the expulsion from Spain, and they and before there were Jews in Spain, and they spoke native Arabic, and they had adopted the language and customs of the Arab conquerors that conquered Syria in the 7th century. And these Jews who spoke Arabic called themselves Mista'arvim, or in Arabic, Musta'arabin, ones who become like Arabs, Arabized Jews. So the spies at the early days of the state, when they're looking for a name for themselves, they come up with this old name, which is a native word from the experience of Jews in the Middle East, describing the act of fitting in, of becoming like the surroundings, of becoming Arabized, and they apply it to intelligence. So they call themselves Mistarvim, and that's how the word enters modern Hebrew and becomes a word that's used in an intelligence context. And today we still use it. In fact, there's a whole series on Netflix called Fauda, which is about Mistarvim. That's the whole point of the show. Mistarvim.
Right, exactly. It's a perfect example, right? Everyone watched in Poland Fauda.
Fauda. Now, Fauda is a great show, and there are two things going on in that show, and there's two things at least going on in this book. In Fauda, the agents are Mista'arvim. They cross enemy lines by assuming Arab identities. That's one level. But if you keep watching the show to season 2, then you understand the second level, which is that the agents themselves come from Jewish families that come from the Arab world. In season 2, you meet the father of Doron, the main agent, and you realize that he's a Jew. I think he's from Egypt, but he's an Arabic speaker. He's not a Mista'arev. He is an Arab, maybe. He might not call himself that, but certainly he's a native of the Arab world. Arabic is his native language. It's not a pretense. And in the same way, with my Mistarvim, these agents who I'm describing, they call themselves ones who become like Arabs, but their Arab identities aren't fake. They're real. They don't have to be taught Arabic. That's their native language. That's their mother tongue. So there's a lot going on in the word Mistarvim. It's not exactly clear if these are people who aren't Arabs pretending to be Arabs, or if these are people who are Arabs pretending not to be Arabs, pretending to be Arabs. It's a very complicated story.
It is very complicated. Even I can, all right, I'm following you slowly, but I'm following you. It's amazing because, almost no one knows about it. And I also wrote it down because I don't want to forget it. It's in Palmach, which is, by the way, people should know, is very Ashkenazi Zionist movement, had an Arab section. This Arab section called Hamal Lakaha Ravit Hashachar, and they made unbelievably a great and amazing job. And so that's we know, but I want to ask you something a little different. How they were treated after 1948 by the so-called Ashkenazi society here in Israel?
Well, the word that you mentioned when you said Machlaka Aravit, and you added a word which is Hashachar. That was the other name for this section, Machleket Hashachar, which literally means the dawn section. Actually, that was not the original name. The original name was Machleket Hashchorim, which comes from the same word as shachal, but it means the black section. They were called black. They called themselves black, and they were called black by others, and it's an indication of their uncertain place in the hierarchy in Israel at that time. In pre-state Israel, or in British Mandate Palestine, 9 out of every 10 Jews came from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, Poland and Arab settlement. Only 1 in 10 came from the Islamic world, from the Arab world. This was a very small minority, and they weren't taken seriously. The Zionist movement really wasn't thinking about Jews in the Middle East. And they didn't really know what to do with them, and they seemed strange, right? They didn't speak Yiddish. What kind of Jew doesn't speak Yiddish? Who are these people? They seem like Arabs. What do we do with them? Mm-hmm. And it would have been wise to understand that if you're setting up a Jewish state in the Middle East, the fact that a big part of your population is going to be Jews from the Middle East is good. That's a good thing. You can work with that. That's a bridge to the region where you're trying to set yourself up. But the Zionist leadership didn't think like that, and they didn't really think very much of the Middle East, and they weren't really interested in the Middle East as a place. They were returning to the biblical homeland, and they were part of the global proletarian revolution. They were part of the socialist revolution, but they weren't interested in Islam. That wasn't what they were about. They had different ideas which weren't really linked to the region, and a lot was missed as a result. The people who set up the state of Israel, in my opinion, were geniuses, and they were, we owe them everything. And the guys who came from places like Plonsk and revolutionized Jewish history, I feel like they saved my life and many hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. But they had blind spots. There were things that they didn't see, and one of the main things that they didn't see was the value of Jews from the Islamic world. And these people were treated with disdain. And their culture was quarantined, and their music was kept off the radio. And they were moved to the sidelines of the state, both the political sidelines and the physical periphery of the state. Right. They were sent to development towns in the south. And only now are we beginning to slowly kind of mend that wound in Israeli society. But it still exists very much, and it's still a big part of our politics, and a big part of our arguments here are that the ethnic divide that was created here in the early years of the state between Jews who came from Europe and set up the state for themselves, and this wave of immigration that came from the Islamic world and has been fighting for its place in Israel since then. The spies are a part of that story, and that's another thing that makes them so interesting and useful to understanding Israel today in 2020.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the perception of your book in Israel, because I saw like 2 interviews you made, once in the, I think in the Beit Avihai, mm-hmm. and a second one somewhere in States. It was completely 2 different conversations. But what is the perception of your book in Israel? You see, that's what is interesting for me right now.
Right, so it came out in Hebrew at a very bad time, unfortunately, right as the Corona shutdown hit in the spring. So it took a while for it to be read, and we haven't been able to do any events. Or I was really looking forward to an event at Beit HaPalmach. The Palmach Museum was planning to host an event. Everything's been on hold because we can't have public events, but the responses have been very interesting. And the responses from the families of the spies have been wonderful. People are so happy to see these guys get some credit because they were completely overlooked, and the families are thrilled to see. This isn't a simple story, and they're not simple heroes, and it's not a story written with adulation. It's a complicated story. It's a real story, and I think they're real heroes. And the families have been happy to see it, and a lot of people who kind of appreciate the lack of attention paid to that part of Israeli society. People appreciate the book. There have been negative comments as well about criticism in the book about the way these guys were treated. People have written me to say that's not true. The discrimination.
They told that this is not true.
Not the whole story, but the discrimination that these guys faced among the Ashkenazim in the early state. It's painful. It's a painful memory for people, and it's not an easy subject for Israelis, but Israelis at least are very much aware of the subject. I think observers of Israel from the outside don't even know that this is being discussed. So for most people reading this book in the West, it's the first time they're really reading about this side of Israel. For Israelis, the book enters a debate that's already very much alive and kicking in Israeli society, and is probably one of the most important debates in Israeli society right now.
Yeah, exactly, right now, because I just want to ask you a couple more questions, because, all right, not bad. we know people from Ethiopia, I know people from Yemen, from different countries. And I saw also like a half year ago, maybe a huge demonstration close to the building of the main court of Ethiopian people who were kicked out from Israel. So this tension is still very uh, uh, very important between the so-called Ashkenazi or whatever, black and white. Yeah, black and white. Let's use the words. And how it looks like now, especially in Corona time, when people are every week are demonstrating against the Netanyahu. Oh, another question. This is the first question. And second question, Matti, please answer us. Why Netanyahu?
I mean, the
Because
question,
it's connected.
yeah, the questions are connected. I mean, the base of Israeli politics are often, divided simplistically into left and right, and it's not really, it doesn't really break down the way it used to. It's not really about whether peace is possible with the Palestinians. No one really thinks it is. There are other deeper reasons why someone would vote for the Likud and someone would vote for a party like Blue and White. What part of the breakdown, it's not as simple as this, but part of the breakdown is ethnic. The base of Likud is Israelis who have roots in the Islamic world. And the base of Blue and White, or what used to be the Labor Party, that's that same part of the political spectrum, Jews who came from Europe, and you can't ignore it. And a lot of the arguments that seem to be about left and right are actually arguments about something else entirely. And it has a lot to do with where your family comes from. Netanyahu's base to this day is still, it leans heavily on Jews who came from the Middle East and from the broader Islamic world. His closest lieutenants, people like Amir Ohana, who's the minister in charge of police, Miri Regev, they come from the Islamic world, and they have a different attitude toward the Islamic world, different political ideas, and that very much is in play in what's going on now. The anti-elitist politics in Israel, we have anti-elitist politics everywhere now in the United States in the form of Trump, and in Europe, of course. In Israel, the anti-elitist political position is often ethnic, because the elites here, the judiciary, the media, the upper echelons of the government have always been largely Ashkenazi. Mm-hmm. And the people criticizing them have largely been Mizrahim. So the debate here about left and right, or elite and anti-elite, is often a debate still about Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and whose Israel is it, and who gets to decide who's Israeli or not, and who gets to decide who's in and who's out. And these are debates that go back to the very first days of the state of Israel, when people began to arrive here from the Middle East, expecting to be greeted like returning brothers, and instead were treated like second-class citizens. And that insult echoes 70 years later and kind of infects our politics in ways that we have not been successful in eradicating. So the current political dilemma has a lot to do with that. Netanyahu has been although of course Netanyahu is very much an elitist Ashkenazi, he's secular. He would see, and he's wealthy, he would seem to have very little in common with the base, but he has been very adept at speaking to people who come from that background, channeling their anger, understanding them in a way that the labor establishment never understood them, and using it as political power in a way that's very, very effective. So when you ask why Netanyahu has been so successful at survival, that's a big part of the reason he really gets something about Israeli society that the leaders of the left have never understood.
Well, we'll see what happens. Hopefully it will not be a fourth election. But once again, this is one of the most unpredictable part of the world, Israel, which we love very, very, very much. And before I thank you, Matti, I'm confused a little bit, only a little bit, but what about these poor Poles who are watching us right now? They still believe that Israel is a nice, beautiful country where you can walk on the beach and swim in the sea and see the Jerusalem. If you just came to my mind. Let's use imagination, especially under these special circumstances. Matti Friedman is invited to Poland, and he has a rare opportunity to use like a 1.5 up to 2 minutes and speak to Polish people, to all churches, squares, schools, wherever it is possible. People who are hungry the answer on the very important, significant question. Actually, two questions. What is a Jewish soul? What is the Israeli soul? And what is today's Israel about?
Wow, those are questions that would take us several hours to answer, and I'm not sure I even know the answer.
Okay, I prepare the next coffee, no problem.
Unfortunately, I can't drink the coffee, but
this is very important.
It's really hard to put your finger on what the Jewish soul is. It's definitely there's definitely real electricity there. There's an electricity in Israel that I haven't seen in any other country, and I've been around, and of course
I agree.
I've been in America, and there are countries that would see that are great, that really are great, and countries that seem to have a lot going on, and then you come to Israel, and it's on another level. And part of it is that people are looking for meaning. There's a lot of people here for whom superficial explanations are not sufficient. So the fact that things seem one way isn't enough, because people need a bigger idea. And of course, Zionism was a big idea about how the world was supposed to be repaired, and Judaism has a lot of big ideas trying to reconcile reality with the divine, or reality with great ideas about how the world should be. And there's a lot of tension from the Bible to Israeli politics in 2020, the tension between how we want things to be and the way things are. And I think that's something fairly unique. It exists, of course, to some extent elsewhere, but I've never really seen it to the same degree of intensity. Life here is very intense, and people have a lot of ideas about the country and about themselves and about the world. And there's a lot of ideas in play in a way that can drive you completely crazy if you just want to relax and live your life, but in a way that also energizes the place in a way that's very special. But I would suggest when this terrible pandemic era is over, you should come and not think about any of it. Everyone should come to Israel, forget all the ideas, and do exactly what you said, which is walk along the beach, admire how Jerusalem looks in the evening, go on a hike in the Golan Heights, walk up Mount Hermon,
right?
All the politics and the Bible and the ideas, and just enjoy the country for what it is, which is a very complicated and a very infuriating, but a very compelling and beautiful little.
Absolutely agree. I agree. I am all the time, in the middle of these two levels, actually two spaces, the fiction space, which I really love very much, and in documentary, of course. Matti, I have no words to thank you, and I'm really so sad and disappointed. What does it mean, disappointed? We cannot meet each other face to face in Yerushalayim or in Krakow, but please keep in your mind, you are invited to Krakow, and I'm more than sure that a lot of people would love to meet you here. And I wish myself to meet you before you come to Krakow in Yerushalayim, so I will go first to you. And we'll sit around the table as always, and we'll talk about the life, death, and the future, which is, thank God, completely unpredictable. And let it be. Thank you so much, Matti. All the best to you and your family. Stay well, Chazak ve'emat, and leitraot as soon as possible.
Mito, thank you so much for having me, and give my regards to everyone in Poland. I hope we meet soon.
Thank you, Matti. Take care. Bye.